What if a prince, born into unimaginable privilege, conspired with his wife to bring the monarchy to its knees? What if the very institution built on loyalty, secrecy, and the preservation of image was threatened, not by an outsider, not by an enemy across the sea, but by one of their own? Tonight, we step into the shadows of Buckingham Palace, where the whispers of betrayal turned into accusations of treason, and where Princess Anne's discovery changed the fate of her younger brother forever. Let me ask you this. When you picture betrayal, do you imagine daggers in the dark, coded letters, or secret tapes passed hand to hand? Because according to those closest to the crown, these weren't scenes from a movie. They were reality. Private conversations weren't just overheard. They were allegedly recorded. Confidential letters weren't just destroyed. They were preserved and then weaponized. And the shocking twist? Harry, the once beloved spare, wasn't a victim of manipulation in this story. He was allegedly an active participant. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Think about that for a second. A son of Charles, the grandson of Queen Elizabeth, a man who once wore the uniform of the British Army and saluted his grandmother's coffin in front of millions, now whispered about as someone who helped plot the monarchy's undoing. How does something like that happen? And more importantly, how did Princess Anne, the most overlooked, underestimated member of the royal family, become the one to uncover it? This isn't a simple scandal. It's not just another tabloid headline. This is a story of blackmail, betrayal, and a family that almost saw its darkest secrets exposed to the world. And make no mistake, those secrets could have brought down the crown itself. Now, before we dive into what Princess Anne found, let's step back for a moment. Because to understand how explosive this moment was, you have to understand the cracks that had already formed. Harry had long been the restless one, the boy who never fit into the mold his older brother seemed born to wear. From early on, there was a narrative. William was duty, Harry was trouble. And while the palace tried to manage that image, it only grew louder with every misstep, every headline, every whisper about Harry's choices. Then came Meghan. To some, she was a breath of fresh air. To others, she was gasoline poured onto already smoldering embers. Together, Harry and Meghan represented not just change, but defiance. They didn't play by the rules. They didn't respect the boundaries of never complain, never explain. They wanted their own spotlight, their own freedom, their own empire. And when the family didn't yield, that's when the whispers began. That's when certain figures close to the palace claimed Meghan and Harry crossed the line from rebellious to dangerous. Because what do you do when you feel the system is stacked against you? You reach for leverage. You gather ammunition. You prepare to use secrets as a weapon. But here's the twist most people don't know. The palace had always feared blackmail. For centuries, enemies of the crown tried to dig up dirt, to find hidden scandals, to twist personal weaknesses into bargaining chips. The difference now was that the threat wasn't coming from the outside. It was allegedly being plotted from within. And that is why Anne's discovery was so disturbing. Picture her for a moment. Not the glamorous royal on the balcony, not the glossy magazine cover, but the woman who had spent her life in the background, doing her duty without fuss, and was not the type to indulge in gossip or drama. She had always been the quiet observer, the one who noticed when something didn't add up, the one who listened when others dismissed. So when the first odd detail crossed her path, she didn't shrug it off. She paid attention. But here's where it gets chilling. What Anne uncovered wasn't vague speculation or harmless chatter. It was tangible, physical, evidence that suggested Harry and Meghan weren't just venting frustrations in private. They were keeping receipts, letters, notes, and recordings, the kind of material that, if released, would have left the monarchy defenseless. Imagine the horror of realizing your private family arguments, your most sensitive conversations, weren't confined to palace walls. Imagine realizing that someone within the bloodline had allegedly collaborated to preserve those moments, and not for sentimental reasons. For leverage, for power, for blackmail. Now let's pause for a second. Ask yourself, if you were in Princess Anne's shoes, what would you do? Do you stay silent, protect the family name, hope it all blows over? Or do you march straight to your brother, the king, and put everything on the table? And chose the latter. And that decision set off a chain of events that would lead directly to Prince Harry being effectively cast out. Not simply by distance, not by choice, but by decree. But before we get there, we need to talk about why this matters now, why this isn't just a scandal buried in dusty archives. Because the monarchy has never been more vulnerable. Charles, already battling health issues. William, under the crushing weight of preparing for the throne. Camilla, facing scrutiny every time she steps out. And Kate, the image of resilience, hiding her struggles behind a smile. Against that backdrop, the revelation that Harry allegedly conspired in blackmail isn't just family drama. It's a threat to the institution's very survival. If the monarchy cannot even trust its own blood, how can it expect the public to trust them? If one of their own is willing to expose them, what secrets remain safe? And here's where the irony hits hardest. Meghan and Harry had often spoken of their truth. But according to what and uncovered, it wasn't about truth at all. It was about power, control, getting what they wanted, not through honesty, but through intimidation. That is why this story matters now. Because if even a fraction of what and revealed is true, it redefines everything we thought we knew about Harry's role in the family. He wasn't the wayward prince running from duty. He wasn't just the victim of harsh headlines and unfair comparisons. He was allegedly an active player in a dangerous game. And that changes everything. So as we open this story, keep one question in your mind. How far would you go to secure your freedom? Would you walk away? Or would you burn the bridge behind you so no one could ever drag you back? Because according to Princess Anne, Harry chose the fire. But here's the part that will haunt you, and didn't just stumble across one slip of paper or one out-of-context remark. She uncovered patterns, layers, a deliberate plan that suggested more than frustration. It suggested conspiracy. And once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. And yet, even with all of this, the family didn't act immediately. They hesitated. They hoped perhaps it was all a misunderstanding, that Harry could explain himself, that Meghan's ambition hadn't crossed into outright treachery. But as we'll see, hesitation was their first mistake. Because the deeper and dug, the darker the picture became. And just when the family thought they could contain the scandal, control the damage, and keep it within their gilded walls, something happened that forced their hand. Something that turned whispers into undeniable proof. And that, dear viewer, is where our story truly begins. Because what Anne discovered next wasn't just disturbing. It was explosive. The kind of revelation that would push a king to act against his own son. The kind of revelation that would leave Harry with no way back. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the most explosive betrayals don't begin with fireworks, but with silence? What if the storm that shakes a dynasty starts not with a bang, but with whispers you almost ignore? That's exactly how this chapter of the royal saga began, with moments so subtle, so ordinary, that most people dismissed them. But Princess Anne didn't. She saw the signs, and as history would prove, those signs pointed to disaster. At first glance, everything in the royal family seemed manageable. Not perfect, not harmonious, but at least stable on the surface. Publicly, Harry and Meghan were carving their life outside the palace. In interviews, in Netflix specials, in podcasts, they told their truth. They spoke of struggle, of racism, of feeling trapped. To their supporters, they were trailblazers. To their critics, they were deserters. But behind closed doors, that's where things were far darker than the public imagined. Ask yourself this. How does a family built on secrecy survive when two of its own step outside the circle and begin to speak? More importantly, what happens when those two aren't content with telling stories, but allegedly begin collecting the family's most private moments like trophies? That was the quiet before the storm, and it terrified the royals. Princess Anne had spent her entire life surrounded by storms. She had seen scandals come and go, divorces, affairs, financial disasters, even brushes with criminal trials. Nothing surprised her anymore. But this felt different. Harry wasn't just reckless. Meghan wasn't just outspoken. Together, they seemed strategic. They seemed to be working toward something bigger. And that something, as Anne would discover, wasn't liberation. It was leverage. Let's rewind to the quiet months before Anne's discovery. The family was still reeling from Queen Elizabeth's passing. Charles was new to the throne, still trying to secure his footing as monarch while battling his own health challenges. William and Catherine were shouldering an enormous burden, raising young children while preparing for their inevitable destiny as king and queen. Camilla was walking a tightrope of public opinion, every move scrutinized. In that fragile atmosphere, unity was essential. Any crack in the foundation could split the institution. Harry knew this. Meghan knew this. And yet, their actions suggested they were pushing harder than ever before. In Montecito, surrounded by Hollywood agents and publicists, Harry and Meghan were busy signing deals, writing memoirs, and promising bombshell revelations. Each one brought them money. Each one brought them headlines. And each one sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. But what most didn't know was that behind the glitzy exterior, a darker plan was allegedly taking shape. One built not on what they had achieved, but on what they could threaten to reveal. Here's the contradiction that haunted the royals. Harry had always painted himself as the victim of media intrusion, begging for privacy. Yet, according to what, and would later uncover, he wasn't just living in privacy. He was allegedly recording private moments of others. Do you see the irony? The man who hated exposure might have been the one weaponizing exposure against his own blood. And think about this. Meghan often claimed she wanted to modernize the monarchy, to drag it into the 21st century. But was that modernization, or was it manipulation? Was it progress, or was it blackmail dressed in glossy language? The lines blurred, and the family didn't know what to believe. And, however, believed her instincts. And her instincts told her something was off. She began noticing patterns. Harry's visits back to the UK seemed less about reconciliation and more about reconnaissance. Conversations felt staged, as if certain lines were being remembered rather than exchanged. Meghan's letters, notes, and carefully curated statements seemed less like communication and more like documentation, as if each word had a second purpose. And that's when Anne started paying attention not just to what was said, but how it was preserved. But why Anne? Why not Charles, or William, or even palace staff? The answer is simple. Anne had nothing to prove. She wasn't the heir. She wasn't the monarch. She wasn't vying for popularity. She was duty incarnate, and with that came clarity. Others were too emotional, too entangled, and saw the game for what it was. The calm before the storm was deceptive. On the outside, there were garden parties, ribbon cuttings, and balcony waves. On the inside, there were doubts, suspicions, and unease. Harry and Meghan's public complaints could be tolerated. What couldn't be tolerated was the whisper that they had something more dangerous in their possession. Letters, recordings, and not just harmless anecdotes, but secrets so sensitive, so devastating, that their release could have fractured the monarchy beyond repair. Now pause for a moment and imagine this from Anne's perspective. She had grown up in the shadow of scandal after scandal. But through it all, the family had one unspoken rule: you never turn on each other. Outsiders might mock, criticize, or speculate, but inside, loyalty was survival. And yet, here was her own brother, allegedly betraying that rule. Not just breaking it, but shattering it. And isn't that the most disturbing part of betrayal? It doesn't come from strangers. It comes from those closest to you. From those you least expect. From those you should be able to trust with your life. So what did Anne do? Did she confront Harry directly? Did she raise it at the family table? No, not yet. She bided her time. Because she knew something bigger was brewing. The whispers were turning into warnings. And the calm was only the beginning. That's the cruel irony of storms. You don't see the destruction at first. You just feel the air shift. You hear the silence before the thunder. You sense something is wrong, even if you can't yet explain it. That was the royal family in those months. Smiles on balconies, secrets in shadows, and quietly connecting the dots while everyone else looked away. Let me ask you directly. If you were in her shoes, would you sound the alarm immediately and risk looking paranoid? Or would you wait, gather evidence, and strike only when you were certain? That was Anne's dilemma, and her choice would make all the difference. Because the calm before the storm didn't last. It never does. Soon, Anne would stumble across something she was never meant to see. Something that confirmed her worst fears. And once she did, there was no going back. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever noticed how in every family there's one person who sees what no one else does? They don't speak much. They don't draw attention to themselves. But when they do speak, their words carry weight, because they've been watching the entire time. In the British royal family, that person has always been Princess Anne. The woman often described as the most no-nonsense member of the monarchy. The one who doesn't fuss with glamour, who doesn't court headlines, who doesn't seek sympathy. And it was that very nature that made her the perfect silent watcher in the storm that was about to engulf the monarchy, and was the child who grew up in the shadow of a crown she would never wear. She wasn't the heir like Charles. She wasn't the adored people's princess like Diana would later become. She wasn't even expected to play the central role of William or Harry. And maybe that's why she developed the one thing the rest of the family lacked: perspective. She could see the chessboard clearly because she wasn't trying to be the king or queen on it. Now ask yourself this: who's more dangerous to someone plotting in secret, the loud voices or the quiet eyes in the corner of the room? And was that quiet eye watching, calculating, noticing? While Harry and Meghan's moves grabbed headlines, Anne's reactions never made the papers. She didn't rant in interviews. She didn't write books. She didn't text journalists behind closed doors. She simply observed. And sometimes, observation is the most powerful weapon of all. Let's put it bluntly, Anne had never trusted Meghan. Not because of her nationality, not because of her background, but because she saw through the performance. Where others were charmed, Anne was cautious. Where others offered sympathy, and reserved judgment. And as the years rolled on, her instincts only sharpened. She started noticing small things. A question Harry asked in passing that seemed oddly specific. A detail Meghan repeated that she should never have known. The way conversations seemed to circle back to grievances, almost rehearsed, as if meant to be remembered later. And for Anne, that was enough to raise a silent alarm. But here's the contradiction that gnawed at her. Harry was her brother's son, a boy she had watched grow from a mischievous child into a soldier, a husband, a father. Could he really be capable of treachery? Or was he simply swept up in something larger, guided by Meghan's ambition? This was the emotional weight Anne carried. She wasn't just watching as a royal. She was watching as an aunt. And betrayal from blood cuts far deeper than betrayal from strangers. And silence wasn't passivity. It was strategy. She knew that if she moved too quickly, she'd be dismissed as paranoid. Too slowly, and the damage could already be done. So she bided her time, storing every inconsistency in her memory, every slip of the tongue, every detail that didn't add up. Do you know what it feels like to see something everyone else ignores? To carry the burden of knowledge without proof? That was Anne's world. Every family gathering, every awkward smile, every carefully worded conversation. She was dissecting them. The others saw polite chit-chat and saw coded messages, carefully chosen phrases, rehearsed complaints. And then came the moment that shifted everything. It started, innocuously enough, with a letter. A folded piece of paper that crossed Anne's path by accident, slipped into her awareness when it wasn't meant to. On the surface, it looked like nothing, just another exchange of correspondence between Harry and someone he trusted. But when Anne read it, she froze. Because in it, she saw references to recordings. Words lifted directly from conversations that had taken place inside palace walls. Conversations that should never have left the room. And that was when it clicked. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't family gossip. This was real. And, the silent watcher, had stumbled into the first thread of a tapestry she was never supposed to see. And once she pulled that thread, she would unravel secrets so dangerous, so explosive, they would forever change her view of Harry and Meghan. But before we get to that, let's pause. Because this is where you have to put yourself in her shoes. Imagine being the only one in the room who sees the danger. Imagine knowing something that could rip your family apart, and realizing you may be the only one willing to confront it. Would you speak? Or would you wait? And waited, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted certainty. And certainty, as she would learn, was just around the corner. Because soon after that letter, another clue would fall into her lap. And this time, it wouldn't just suggest betrayal. It would confirm it. The silent watcher was about to become the reluctant whistleblower. But what she uncovered next would leave even her shaken. Because letters were one thing. What she found next proved there were recordings. And those recordings carried voices that should never, ever have been heard outside palace walls. And that discovery was the spark. The moment when Anne realized this wasn't just family drama anymore. This was conspiracy. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What would you do if you stumbled upon a letter that wasn't meant to exist? A letter that whispered secrets too sharp to ignore, A letter that carried the potential to destroy everything your family had spent centuries building? That was the dilemma Princess faced when her eyes scanned words that were never intended for her. And in that instant, the storm she had sensed in the air broke wide open. The letter was not formal. It wasn't written on embossed stationery or wrapped in official seals. No, it was casual, almost careless, as though written in haste, and that made it all the more dangerous. Because hidden inside that casual tone was something far darker. And read references to conversations she recognized. Exact words spoken in rooms where privacy was sacred. Words uttered in the belief that they would die in the air as soon as they were spoken. And yet, here they were, preserved in ink. Preserved as proof. How could this be? Who was keeping these records? And more importantly, why? Anne's hands trembled as she folded the paper back. She was not one to rattle easily. She had faced assassination attempts, endured media scrutiny, carried the burdens of royal life without flinching. But this letter was different. Because it wasn't an external threat. It wasn't an enemy across the sea. It was coming from within. Think about that for a moment. The royal family had survived wars, revolutions, even abdications. But survival had always depended on one golden rule. Family secrets stayed in the family. Break that rule, and the entire edifice crumbles. So when Anne realized these letters shouldn't exist, she also realized something even more disturbing. Someone wanted them to exist. Someone was deliberately recording, documenting, and preserving the monarchy's most private wounds. The name Harry appeared more than once. Not just in passing, but in ways that suggested participation. That suggested knowledge. That suggested cooperation. Meghan's name was there too, referenced in ways that tied her to the act of keeping records. Together, their names sat like loaded bullets on the page. And here's the contradiction that hit and hardest. Harry had spent years telling the world he wanted freedom from the palace. Freedom from scrutiny. Freedom from exposure. But if these letters were real, and Anne had no reason to doubt them, then he wasn't running from exposure. He was allegedly manufacturing it, storing it, holding it like a weapon for the right moment. Can you feel the irony? The man who hated the spotlight was allegedly creating the very arsenal that would thrust his family into it. And didn't sleep that night. She paced her private quarters, replaying the words in her mind, trying to imagine the scale of what she had just uncovered. Were there more letters? Were there recordings to match them? And if so, who else knew? This wasn't paranoia anymore. This wasn't speculation. This was evidence. The next day, Anne quietly began to observe more carefully. At family gatherings, she noticed how Harry carried himself. Defensive, guarded, quick to deflect questions. Meghan, by contrast, was bold, almost fearless, as though she held cards no one else at the table did. It was in her eyes, in her tone, in her confidence. And Anne realized with a sinking heart, Meghan wasn't just the spark. She might be the strategist. But here's the question that haunted her. Was Harry the victim of manipulation, or had he willingly joined the game? The letters didn't answer that. They only hinted. But the hints were enough. Enough to suggest that Harry wasn't merely dragged along. He was contributing. And that, for Anne, was the most devastating blow. Because it meant this wasn't just Meghan versus the monarchy. It was Harry versus the monarchy too. Imagine the weight of that realization. Your nephew, the boy you watched ride ponies, laugh in gardens, salute at ceremonies, now painted as a conspirator in something that could unravel the crown. How do you process that? Do you cling to denial? Or do you accept the brutal truth staring back at you in ink? And accepted it. Because denial was a luxury she couldn't afford. But she also knew she couldn't go to Charles yet. Not without more. Not without undeniable proof. Because Charles was a father before he was a king. His instinct would be to protect Harry, to excuse him, to rationalize. And if Charles dismissed the danger too quickly, the family would be left defenseless. So, Anne held her silence. She tucked the letter away, hidden where no one else would find it. But in her mind, the alarm bells were deafening. And then, almost as if fate had aligned with her suspicion, more evidence began to surface. A passing remark overheard. A misplaced folder. References whispered in private circles. Each one pointed in the same direction. The letters weren't isolated. They were part of a larger cache. And somewhere out there, recordings existed. Recordings. The very word made Anne's stomach turn. Because letters could be denied. Handwriting questioned. Authorship disputed. But recordings? Recordings carry voices. Voices don't lie. And if those recordings ever saw daylight, there would be no denying the betrayal. Let me ask you, if someone close to you had recordings of your most private moments, how would you feel? Imagine the humiliation, the helplessness, the fear of wondering what they might release, when, and why. That was the nightmare and realized the monarchy could be facing. And it wasn't just any recordings. These weren't trivial anecdotes or harmless banter. The letters hinted at conversations about family tensions, financial disputes, health concerns, the kind of secrets that, if revealed, would spark global headlines and irreparably damage the monarchy's reputation. Anne's blood ran cold. The silent watcher had found her proof. The storm she had sensed had finally broken. And she knew, in that moment, that she could no longer ignore it. Still, she wasn't ready to reveal her hand. She wanted to see just how deep this went. Because if Harry and Meghan truly were conspiring to blackmail the crown, the monarchy had to understand the full scope before acting. So she waited again, watching, listening, gathering. Every instinct sharpened, every suspicion validated. And with each new detail, the picture became clearer, darker, more dangerous. And had stumbled upon the letters that shouldn't exist. But what she would uncover next was even worse. Because the whispers about recordings weren't just rumors. They were real. And once Anne heard them with her own ears, the conspiracy would no longer be deniable. It would be undeniable. And that discovery would leave her with one terrifying conclusion. Harry wasn't just part of the family anymore. He was part of the threat. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What's more dangerous than a letter? A voice. A voice captured when it should never have been. A voice speaking in confidence, preserved forever in a file that could one day be unleashed like a weapon. That was the reality Princess Anne faced when she realized the whispers about recordings weren't just rumors. They were fact. And those recordings carried with them the power to bring the monarchy to its knees. Imagine this. You're in a private room, speaking freely, believing the walls are your shield. You vent frustrations, you make offhand remarks, you let slip details that could embarrass, even destroy, if they reach the outside world. Now imagine someone was recording all of it. Not an outsider, not a spy, but one of your own. That's what Anne uncovered. The first clue had come in the letters, words lifted so precisely that they could only have come from one source, recordings. At first, she hoped it was an exaggeration, a bluff, a careless slip. But soon after, her fears crystallized. Because she heard it. A file, a snippet, something not meant for her ears, but which confirmed her darkest suspicion. It wasn't polished. It wasn't edited. It was raw, muffled at times, but unmistakable. Voices of the family, tense, tired, private. Voices that had no business being anywhere except the moment they were spoken. And yet here they were, replayed as evidence. Let's stop here and ask the obvious. How do recordings like that come into existence? Was Harry secretly carrying a device into meetings? Was Meghan encouraging him to preserve conversations for their truth-telling projects? Or was it something more insidious? Hidden phones, clever setups, the quiet gathering of dirt? The truth, as Anne realized, was probably a mix. Harry had grown paranoid. Meghan had grown strategic. Together, they had motive. And motive is all it takes to cross the line from grievance to conspiracy. Think of the irony. Harry, who had once sued tabloids for hacking his phone, now stood accused of recording his own family. The contradiction is almost unbearable. The man who wanted privacy was the one allegedly violating it most brutally, and replayed the snippet in her mind long after she heard it. The tone of the voices, the words spoken, the kind of remarks that, if aired publicly, would dominate global headlines for months. Remarks about money, about favoritism, about family rivalries that had been carefully hidden from the public eye. The kind of things that humanize royals but also diminish them, stripping away the mystique of monarchy and leaving behind nothing but soap opera drama. And that was the danger. Because the monarchy doesn't survive on power alone. It survives on image, on mystique, on the illusion of perfection. Destroy that, and the crown crumbles. So here was the horror. Harry and Meghan allegedly had the power to destroy it with the push of a button. Anne's heart pounded as she processed what this meant. She wasn't just holding evidence of betrayal. She was holding evidence of blackmail. Because why else preserve recordings like these? Not for family albums. not for nostalgia, but for leverage. The leverage of silence, the leverage of threat, the leverage that whispers, "Give us what we want, or we show the world what you've been hiding." Now pause for a moment and think about the scale of that threat. We're not talking about one or two conversations. We're talking about months, maybe years, of private words potentially preserved in files. Enough to write not just one memoir, but 10. Enough to drip-feed scandal after scandal into the press, each one more damaging than the last. That was the arsenal and realized Harry and Meghan had built. An arsenal hidden in shadows, waiting to be deployed. But why would Harry do this? Wasn't he still his father's son, his grandmother's grandson, his brother's brother? The answer is complicated. Harry had always felt trapped, marginalized, cast as the spare while William was groomed as the heir. Meghan, too, had felt silenced, disrespected, alienated. Together, their grievances morphed into a sense of justification. To them, gathering evidence wasn't treachery. It was insurance, protection, a way to even the playing field against an institution they believed had wronged them. But for Anne, intent didn't matter. Results did. And the result was clear. The family's most private moments were no longer private. The emotional weight of that realization nearly crushed her. She thought of her late mother, Queen Elizabeth, who had dedicated her life to preserving the monarchy's dignity. She thought of her brother, Charles, now king, struggling to steady the ship. She thought of William, carrying the weight of the future on his shoulders. And she thought of Harry, the boy she had once teased, once guided, now allegedly turned against them. And isn't that the cruelest twist of all? Betrayal doesn't hurt because of what is said. It hurts because of who says it. And knew she couldn't stay silent forever. Not this time. But she also knew the timing had to be perfect. Revealed too soon, and Harry could spin it as paranoia, Meghan as persecution. Wait too long, and the recordings might already leak. She was trapped in the same game Harry had allegedly built. A game of timing, leverage, and risk. Let me ask you, what would you do in that position? Would you go to the king immediately and risk being ignored? Or would you gather more, hold your silence, and wait for the perfect moment to strike? And chose the latter. Because she understood something crucial. You only get one chance to expose betrayal. And when that chance comes, you better have enough evidence to crush denial completely. So she held on to the knowledge of the recordings. She waited. She prepared. All while watching Harry and Meghan continue their public campaign, smiling in interviews, lamenting their pain, presenting themselves as victims of the very family they were allegedly undermining. The contradictions were staggering. And felt the fury grow inside her. Fury not just for herself, but for the entire institution. But fury wasn't enough. She needed certainty. She needed the full picture. And soon, she would get it. Because the letters had shown the existence of recordings. The recordings themselves confirmed betrayal. But the next step would expose something even darker, intent, and was about to uncover proof that Harry and Meghan weren't just collecting secrets passively. They were allegedly using them, preparing demands, hinting at consequences if those demands weren't met. And once she saw that, there would be no more hesitation. The silent watcher would become the family's alarm bell. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What is the one thing the British monarchy has always feared more than war, more than scandal, more than even abdication? Exposure. Not exposure in the sense of public appearances or royal duties, but exposure of what lies behind the palace walls. The monarchy has thrived for centuries not only because of its power, but because of its mystery. The mystique. The illusion that what happens inside remains untouchable. Strip that away, and you strip away the magic that keeps people loyal. And that, precisely, was the nightmare Princess Anne realized her family was facing. The recordings weren't just embarrassing. They weren't just inconvenient. They were lethal. A weapon that, in the wrong hands, could turn centuries of carefully constructed image into rubble overnight. Imagine, for a moment, the monarchy's private dysfunctions playing out in public like a reality show. Heated arguments between family members, complaints about money, offhand comments about politicians, doubts about public figures, even jokes, harmless in the moment, but damning when taken out of context. Do you see the danger? One leak, one file, and suddenly the monarchy isn't dignified. It's ordinary. Worse, it's petty. And that is the royal family's worst fear. to be seen not as icons, but as people. Now let's pause and ask the hard question. Why does the monarchy fear exposure so much? Because its survival depends on distance. Distance between the royals and the public. They are meant to be elevated, untouchable, symbols rather than humans. Once you bring them down into the mud of everyday drama, the spell is broken. And when the spell is broken, what's left to justify the crown? And understood this better than anyone. She had lived her life in duty, often mocked for her bluntness, often overlooked in favor of her flashier siblings. But she knew the truth. Mystique is the monarchy's lifeline. And now that lifeline was dangling by a thread. Think about the timing. Charles had just ascended the throne. The transition was fragile. The Commonwealth was already restless. Australia, Canada, Caribbean nations, they were questioning their ties to the monarchy. Public opinion was fractured. William and Kate were under pressure to project stability. And in the middle of that fragile moment came the revelation that Harry and Meghan allegedly had a stockpile of recordings that could humiliate the entire family. What would one leak do in that climate? One clip released online, one recording uploaded anonymously, could unleash chaos. Headlines would explode. Republic movements would surge. The monarchy could find itself under existential threat. And Harry and Meghan? They would hold the detonator. And could see it clearly. This was no longer about sibling rivalry. This wasn't about generational clashes or personality differences. This was about survival. And here's where the contradictions tore at her heart. Harry was both family and foe. Blood and betrayer. She thought of how he had stood at his mother's funeral, a grieving boy walking behind Diana's coffin. She thought of how the public had once adored him for his cheeky smile, his soldier's courage, his humanity. And now? He was allegedly plotting with his wife to destroy the very institution that defined his existence. Why? Why would he do it? Was it resentment? Revenge? Or simply desperation for control in a life where he had always felt powerless? And wrestled with those questions in silence. But she also knew that motives wouldn't matter once the damage was done. Once the recordings were out, no one would care about the why. They would only care about the what. And that, right there, was the royal family's worst fear. Not that Harry and Meghan had grievances, but that they had proof. Proof that could not be denied, explained away, or spun. Because scandals can be managed. Affairs, divorces, even financial improprieties, all of those had been survived before. But raw recordings of the monarchy tearing itself apart from within? That was unthinkable. That was catastrophic. Picture it. Imagine a tape surfacing of Charles expressing frustration about finances. Imagine Meghan releasing a clip of William snapping in anger, Kate sighing in exhaustion, Camilla making an offhand remark. Each one, on its own, may not topple the throne. But together, drip-fed over time, they would bleed the monarchy dry. And that was the strategy and began to see. Not a single explosion, but a slow leak. A slow poisoning. The kind of threat you can't contain once it begins. And realized the family had to prepare for the worst. Quietly, discreetly, she began speaking to those she trusted most. She framed her words carefully, never revealing too much, but planting seeds of caution. Watch what you say. Watch who you trust. The palace walls may no longer protect you. But even as she moved cautiously, she could feel the tension rising. Eyes darting in family gatherings. Conversations cut short when Harry's name came up. The unspoken dread that maybe, just maybe, the worst fear was already true. Now let me turn it to you. What would you do if your entire legacy, your family's survival, your nation's image, depended on secrets staying hidden? Would you cling to denial, pretending it could never happen? Or would you steel yourself for the inevitable storm? The monarchy chose the middle path, hesitating, hoping, praying. But a new hesitation was fatal. Every day they delayed. Every day they pretended it wasn't real. Harry and Meghan's alleged arsenal grew more powerful. And here's the bitter irony. The monarchy's silence, their refusal to address things head-on, was the very weakness Harry and Meghan could exploit. Because silence creates a vacuum. And in that vacuum, rumor becomes truth. Allegation becomes fact. And recordings become bombs. And had no illusions anymore. The royal family's worst fear was standing right at their doorstep. She had seen the letters. She had heard the recordings. And she knew it was only a matter of time before the rest of the family had to face it too. But how would she bring it to them? How do you tell a king that his son is his greatest threat? How do you tell your brother that the child he loves might be conspiring to destroy him? Anne's heart ached with the weight of that decision, but she knew she couldn't carry it much longer. And as fate would have it, she wouldn't have to, because the very next discovery would push everything into the open. A discovery that proved Harry wasn't a passive participant. He wasn't a manipulated victim. He was an active conspirator. And once Anne saw that, there was no turning back. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the prince the world thought it knew was never real? What if behind the smiling interviews, the confessions of pain, the stories of trauma, there existed another Harry? One the public never saw, one the monarchy prayed would never be exposed? That is the revelation Princess Anne came to when she uncovered not just evidence of recordings and letters, but proof of Harry's double life. Because here's the question. Was Harry the victim of manipulation, or was he the mastermind? Up until this point, many had wanted to believe the former. The lost boy swept up in Meghan's ambition. The husband doing whatever it took to protect his wife. The vulnerable child still scarred by Diana's death. That was the story the public wanted to tell. It was easier, cleaner, tragic, but sympathetic. But Anne's discoveries painted another picture. One darker, one harder to forgive. Because the evidence didn't show a passive Harry being dragged along. It showed an active Harry, choosing, scheming, participating. Let's rewind. After Queen Elizabeth's passing, Harry made several trips back to the UK. Some were public, some were private. Each time, the palace extended cautious courtesies, security arrangements, invitations to services, brief opportunities for reconciliation. On the surface, these visits looked like olive branches. But behind closed doors, Anne began to suspect something else. Harry asked too many questions. Questions that didn't feel like a grieving grandson or a repentant son. Questions about schedules. About who would be present at certain meetings. About conversations that hadn't yet been made public. They weren't the questions of someone trying to reconnect. They were the questions of someone collecting data. And saw it. She clocked the patterns. And when the letters and recordings confirmed it, her suspicions hardened into certainty. Harry was leading a double life. On the one hand, he played the exiled prince, lamenting his fate, telling interviewers he wanted peace, insisting he longed for privacy. On the other, he was allegedly conspiring with Meghan to preserve every scrap of private tension within the family, cataloging them for potential use. Do you see the contradiction? The same man who condemned the press for intruding on his childhood was intruding on his own family in the exact same way. The same man who sued tabloids for hacking into his private life was allegedly hacking into his family's through recordings. The hypocrisy was staggering. And yet, it wasn't just hypocrisy. It was betrayal. Because Harry knew the rules. He knew the golden code. Never expose the family. Complain privately. Rage behind closed doors. But never, ever let the world see behind the curtain. And had lived by that code. Charles, too. Even Andrew, despite his scandals, had clung to silence until he was forced into the spotlight. But Harry? Harry seemed to be shredding the code deliberately. And worse, proudly. Ask yourself, what drives someone to that point? Was Harry so embittered by his role as the spare that he wanted to burn down the entire system? Was it loyalty to Meghan above loyalty to blood? Or was it something deeper, a hunger for power he could never have within the monarchy itself? The truth is probably a cocktail of all three. Resentment, loyalty, ambition. Mix them together, and you get a man who no longer saw the monarchy as his home, but as his bargaining chip, and pieced it together like a detective assembling a puzzle. Every letter, every snippet of recording, every odd remark Harry had made during his visits, all of it pointed to one conclusion. Harry was not just caught in Meghan's orbit. He was orbiting with her, willingly. And that was the moment Anne's heart broke. Because as much as she had prepared herself for the possibility of Meghan's manipulation, she had not prepared herself for Harry's complicity. She thought of the boy who used to sneak sweets into palace corridors. The teenager who laughed at William's expense. The soldier who fought with bravery in Afghanistan. That Harry had always been flawed. Yes, reckless, impulsive, but loyal at the core. And now, that core seemed hollowed out, replaced with something unrecognizable. This was no longer the boy she knew. This was a man playing a double game. The royal family had always feared outside threats. The press, politicians, opportunists. But how do you protect yourself when the threat wears your last name? When the traitor shares your blood? That was the chilling question Anne asked herself every night. And here's where it gets worse. Because the letters and recordings didn't just suggest that Harry was documenting. They suggested he was discussing strategy. Not merely a bystander, but a co-architect. His words were preserved. His participation clear. He wasn't just present. He was active. Do you feel the weight of that? The difference between being manipulated and conspiring? One can be forgiven. The other cannot. And knew the family's worst fear had now escalated into its worst reality. Harry wasn't just vulnerable. He was dangerous. But still, she hesitated. She hadn't shown Charles everything. Not yet. Because a father's heart clouds judgment, and Charles would have looked for excuses. He would have asked for patience. He would have wanted to believe his son could be redeemed. And redemption was not what Anne saw. No, what Anne saw was a double life, a hidden game, and a looming act of treachery that could not be ignored. And soon, the proof of intent would arrive. Proof that Harry and Meghan weren't just collecting secrets, but preparing to use them, preparing to weaponize them, preparing to send a message that would shake the monarchy at its core. Letters and recordings were terrifying enough. But the next discovery? That was the smoking gun. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if every smile, every interview, every headline wasn't spontaneous, but part of a larger strategy? What if the very chaos we thought was accidental was in fact intentional, carefully crafted, deliberately timed, part of a grander scheme? That's the chilling question that haunted Princess Anne as she sifted through what she had uncovered. Because the deeper she looked, the clearer it became. Meghan wasn't just reacting to royal rejection. She was allegedly engineering a plan, a master plan. And Harry, far from resisting, was playing along. Let's face it, Meghan has always been a strategist. From Hollywood to Kensington Palace, every step she took seemed deliberate. She understood optics. She understood timing. She understood how to weaponize narrative. And while the world debated whether she was a victim or a villain and began to see something darker, Meghan, as an architect, think about it. Every major moment followed a pattern. A dramatic interview timed before a royal event. A lawsuit launched just as another scandal threatened to eclipse them. A Netflix special dropped exactly when the family was trying to project unity. Coincidence? Or calculation? And was convinced it was the latter. The letters had shown communication that went beyond grievance. They hinted at strategy, discussions of how and when to release certain stories, of what secrets would carry the most weight, of how public opinion could be swayed with just the right revelation at just the right time. And when paired with the recordings, a picture began to emerge. Meghan's alleged master plan wasn't about telling their truth. It was about controlling the narrative, bending it into a weapon, and using it as leverage against the crown. Here's the contradiction that made Anne's blood run cold. Meghan had publicly decried the media machine, saying it chewed her up, spat her out, and tried to silence her. But privately, according to what Anne found, she was allegedly building her own machine. A media empire fueled not by fiction, but by carefully hoarded royal secrets. And Harry? He was her greatest asset. Because without him, the secrets had no bloodline legitimacy. Without him, it was just hearsay. With him, it became undeniable. He was the bridge, the proof, the prince whose voice gave her words weight. And realized then why Meghan and Harry worked so well as a pair. Alone, Harry was wounded but ineffective. Alone, Meghan was ambitious but blocked. Together, they became dangerous. His access, her strategy. His heritage, her hunger. His resentment, her execution. But what exactly was the alleged master plan? And pieced it together step by step. First, gather evidence. Letters, recordings, testimonies. Second, use media platforms to build a sympathetic narrative. Harry and Meghan as victims of a cruel, outdated system. Third, when sympathy alone wasn't enough, deploy the evidence selectively, like weapons. A clip here, a letter there. Enough to frighten the palace, but never enough to burn the arsenal completely. Keep them guessing. Keep them on edge. And finally, leverage that fear into demands. Demands that were never stated openly in public, but hinted at in private. Financial freedom. Security provisions. Titles for their children. Influence in royal decisions. Not requests. Conditions. Conditions backed by the unspoken threat. If you don't give us what we want, We'll show the world what we have. Anne's breath caught when she realized what this meant. It wasn't just rebellion. It wasn't just family tension. It was alleged blackmail, pure and simple. And it was being orchestrated not by chance, but by design. Do you see the irony? Meghan, who had once claimed she was silenced, was allegedly the one holding the megaphone, deciding when and how the story would be told. Meghan, who said she was powerless, was allegedly the one holding all the power. Meghan, who claimed to be a victim of palace control, was allegedly controlling the palace itself through fear, and could no longer deny it. This wasn't just Harry spiraling. This was Meghan's master plan unfolding before her eyes. But here's the tragedy. Harry seemed to embrace it. Rather than resist, rather than push back, he appeared to be an active participant. His resentment of William, his strained relationship with Charles, his bitterness toward the institution, all of it made him susceptible to Meghan's strategy. And once he bought in, he became not just her ally, but her accomplice. And try to imagine the conversations that must have taken place behind closed doors in Montecito. Meghan, laying out the logic. Harry, venting his fury. Meghan, sketching the possibilities. Harry, nodding in agreement. Piece by piece, plan by plan, until a blueprint for blackmail took shape. And isn't that the cruelest part? It wasn't strangers plotting against the monarchy. It wasn't enemies in government or hostile nations. It was family. A prince and his wife, allegedly conspiring to hold the crown hostage with its own secrets. And knew she couldn't sit on this forever. The evidence was mounting. The stakes were rising. And the master plan was becoming harder to ignore. But how do you bring such an accusation forward? How do you tell your brother, the king, that his son and daughter-in-law are allegedly plotting to blackmail him? The emotional cost was immense. Charles, already burdened with illness, would be shattered. William, already carrying the weight of destiny, would be enraged. Camilla would be humiliated. Kate would be wounded. And the monarchy itself would be destabilized. But Anne also knew this. The longer they waited, the more power Meghan's alleged plan gained. Because silence is fuel for blackmail. Every day the family stayed quiet. The leverage grew stronger. So Anne prepared herself. She knew the confrontation was inevitable. The family had to see the truth. The king had to know. The heir had to be warned. The crown had to act. But before she could bring it to them, the plan revealed itself even more clearly. A letter surfaced that left no doubt. A letter not of grievance, but of threat. A letter that carried with it the unmistakable tone of blackmail. And that letter would be the spark that turned whispers into fire. Because once it landed on the desk of the palace, the family could no longer deny the truth. Meghan's alleged master plan was real, and the next move would decide whether the monarchy survived or fell. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What would you do if a letter landed on your desk that could unravel your entire world? A letter not written in fury or passion, but in calm, calculated language. A letter that didn't plead or beg, but threatened. That was the moment the palace faced when Princess Anne's fears finally materialized in black and white. The letter arrived quietly, discreetly, without fanfare. No royal seal. No embossed stationery. Just an envelope slipped into the system, carrying words that were never meant for the public, but were powerful enough to shake the monarchy's foundations. At first glance, it might have seemed like a typical communication, one of the many notes that crossed palace corridors every day. But the moment Anne read it, the blood drained from her face. This wasn't correspondence. It was a demand. The phrasing was deliberate. No screaming. No insults. Just cold precision. It listed grievances, yes, but more than that, it laid out conditions. Titles for children. Security guarantees. Financial assurances. Influence over certain family decisions. And beneath every line pulsed an unspoken threat. Comply or suffer exposure. Anne's hands clenched as she read the final paragraph. It hinted, without saying it outright, that failure to meet these demands would lead to alternative measures. A phrase vague enough to deny, but sharp enough to terrify. Because what else could it mean except the release of the recordings and letters she already knew existed? Ask yourself, how do you fight an enemy who doesn't attack with swords, but with secrets? How do you defend against a weapon that isn't seen but heard? The palace had faced many enemies over centuries. Parliaments, armies, scandals. But this was different. This wasn't public rebellion. This was private extortion. not shouted in the streets, but whispered in an envelope. And the one holding the pen wasn't a stranger. It was family. That's what made it so chilling. This wasn't some tabloid journalist fishing for dirt. This wasn't a disgruntled staff member leaking to the press. This was Harry and Meghan, allegedly writing directly to the monarchy itself. And that shifted the betrayal from rumor into reality. Anne's fury burned like ice. She thought of her mother, Queen Elizabeth, who had survived countless storms by adhering to the rule of silence. Never complain, never explain. But here, silence could be fatal. Because silence wasn't strength anymore. Silence was surrender. She took the letter to Charles. Not immediately, not impulsively, but once she knew it was undeniable. Once she knew this wasn't just suspicion, but proof. Charles sat with it in his hands, his face pale, his eyes scanning the lines as if hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something harmless. But they didn't. Each line cut deeper. Each demand struck at the monarchy's pride. And the unspoken threat between them pulsed like a drumbeat. Comply, or we reveal. For Charles, the pain was doubled. He wasn't just a king holding a threatening letter. He was a father holding proof that his son had turned against him. Imagine that for a moment. The child you cradled, the boy you watched grow, the man you still loved despite everything, now standing on the other side of the battlefield. How do you process that? As a king, Charles had to think of duty. As a father, he wanted to think of forgiveness. But could forgiveness exist in the face of blackmail? And made it clear, this was treason, even if dressed in family language. She reminded him that the monarchy had survived abdication, survived scandal, survived betrayal, but only because those who threatened it were dealt with firmly. To yield now would be to invite destruction. And yet, Charles hesitated. Fathers hesitate where kings cannot. He wondered if Harry was lost, manipulated, confused. But Anne's voice cut through his doubt. This is not confusion. This is choice. The emotional contradiction was unbearable. To act meant punishing his son. To not act meant endangering the crown. And Charles knew one truth above all. He could not serve both family and monarchy. He had to choose. Meanwhile, word of the letter began to ripple through the inner circle. William found out. His fury was volcanic. For years, he had tolerated his brother's antics, hoping for reconciliation. But this was war. In private, he declared that Harry had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Kate, ever the picture of composure, wept when she heard the details. Not for herself, but for the children, for George, Charlotte, and Louis, who would inherit a monarchy under siege from within. Camilla, sharp as ever, didn't weep. She seethed. She saw it not just as betrayal, but as humiliation. The idea that the monarchy could be held hostage by a couple thousands of miles away in California was intolerable. She pressed Charles for action, bluntly telling him that history would not forgive weakness. The walls of Buckingham Palace, once bastions of tradition, now vibrated with anger, fear, and disbelief. But here's the cruel twist. The monarchy couldn't simply go public. They couldn't announce to the world, "We're being blackmailed by Harry and Meghan." Doing so would legitimize the threat and invite more scrutiny. And scrutiny was the very thing they feared most. So they were trapped. Trapped between silence and exposure. Between loyalty and survival. And knew they had to act quietly, strategically, without letting the world see the turmoil. The monarchy's greatest battles are often fought in whispers, not headlines. And this would be no different. Still, the letter changed everything. It was no longer whispers and suspicions. It was proof, tangible proof, and proof demands response. So the family convened. A secret meeting, one that history books may never record, but which shaped the future of the crown, and presented the evidence. William demanded action. Camilla pressed for firmness. And Charles, torn to his core, listened in silence before finally lifting his head and saying, "We cannot yield." Not to them, not to anyone. But even as those words left his mouth, everyone in the room knew what it meant. If they didn't yield, then confrontation was inevitable. If they didn't comply, then Harry and Meghan would have to be confronted and possibly cut off forever. The blackmail letter had forced their hand. And Anne, staring into her brother's weary eyes, understood that the storm was about to break wide open. Because if the monarchy was going to survive, it would have to turn against one of its own. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does rage look like when it belongs to a king? Not the kind of rage that shouts, slams doors, or throws fists. No, the rage of a king is silent, controlled. It doesn't explode outward. It implodes inward, tightening every muscle, hardening every glance, freezing the air around him until everyone else can feel it. That was the atmosphere in Buckingham Palace when King Charles read the letter that proved his worst nightmare true. His son was allegedly blackmailing the crown. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He didn't even put the letter down at first. He just sat there, his eyes fixed on the words, as if staring hard enough could make them dissolve. His jaw clenched so tightly and swore she heard the grind of his teeth. His breathing slowed, heavy, deliberate. Rage, but silent. Think about it for a second. How do you process betrayal when it comes not from your enemies, but from your blood? Charles had survived so much already. Decades of public scrutiny, humiliations, scandals, the impossible task of following his mother's reign. But this was different. This wasn't public scorn. This was private betrayal, weaponized. And that betrayal carried his son's signature. What does a father do in that moment? Part of him wanted to crumple the letter and throw it in the fire. Pretend it didn't exist. Cling to denial like a lifeline. Another part of him wanted to storm into Montecito and demand an explanation. To shout. To cry. To beg. But the king in him knew neither was an option. Kings don't have the luxury of denial. Kings don't beg. Kings decide. And watched him closely. She knew this version of Charles, the silent one, the simmering one, was the most dangerous. Because when Charles bottled his fury, it didn't vanish. It hardened into resolve. And that was what Anne had wanted. She hadn't shown him the letter to wound him as a father. She had shown him to awaken him as a king. To remind him that the monarchy was bigger than Harry. Bigger than blood. But even she hadn't anticipated the depth of his silent rage. Charles finally placed the letter down, but he didn't look at anyone. Not Anne. Not Camilla. Not his advisors. He just stared into the middle distance, his lips pressed thin, his hand resting on the paper like a man trying to keep a serpent pinned to the table. Is it true? He finally asked, his voice low. Anne's reply was sharp, decisive. It's true. Camilla added nothing, but her eyes told the same story. William, when told later, wouldn't even need the evidence. He would believe instantly. But Charles needed the confirmation. Not because he doubted the facts, but because his heart rebelled against them. Silent rage. That was the only way he could hold himself together. Here's the irony. Charles had always been painted as weak, indecisive, too emotional for leadership. But in this moment, that supposed weakness transformed into something else, a determination colder than ice. He wouldn't explode. He wouldn't fall apart. He would act. Slowly, quietly, but decisively. Do you see the danger of silent rage? It doesn't announce itself. It plans. It waits. It strikes at the perfect moment, and recognized it immediately. This was the Charles who had endured decades of mockery, who had survived humiliation in the Diana years, who had waited longer than any heir in history for the throne. This was a man who had swallowed bitterness his entire life, and who now, finally, would not swallow anymore. But what would he do? That was the question haunting everyone in the room. Would Charles confront Harry directly? Would he attempt to reason with him, father to son? Or would he draw the line as king and strip away every privilege Harry still clung to? William's answer, when he was told of the letter, was unambiguous. He has to go. His fury burned hot, where Charles's burned cold. William wanted action immediately. A clean break. Exile. No hesitation. He's not my brother anymore if this is true, he reportedly told Anne. Camilla, too, pressed for firmness. She saw no path to reconciliation. Her words to Charles were cutting. You can't be both father and king. One has to win. And Anne, she stayed silent, but her silence spoke volumes. She had done her part. She had uncovered the truth. Now it was up to Charles. Let me ask you directly, what would you choose in his place? The father's heart or the king's duty? Could you exile your own child to save the institution you swore to protect? Or would you risk the institution for the chance, however slim, that your son could be redeemed? Charles chose silence, for now. But silence with intent. Days passed. The letter remained locked in his private drawer. But the decision was already forming in his mind. Each time he saw William, he saw the future of the monarchy trembling. Each time he saw Anne, he saw the reminder of betrayal. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Harry's face, not as a child, but as a man, the man who had chosen this path. His rage never burst. It calcified. And then, he made his choice. The palace would act. Not rashly, not publicly, but firmly. Harry would be summoned, confronted, forced to answer. But here's the twist. Charles wasn't planning a conversation. He was planning a reckoning. The silent rage had hardened into something irreversible. Because when a king feels betrayed, he doesn't just respond. He punishes. And Harry, oblivious across the ocean, had no idea that his father's silence was not weakness. It was the calm before his personal storm. The summons was already being prepared. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming.